But just to give maybe a quick rundown of the book, what he says at the beginning is that the first few chapters he deals with where we are in terms of the post-enlightenment, post-scientific revolution world. And he says that we are under what some other philosophers like Spengler have called Homo economicus, economic man. Man is now under the dominance of money to the extent that fractional reserve banking, lending right out in terms of interest, that is what dominates man. And he's not critiquing, he's just stating the facts, right? He's saying that that's how we operate. He says we've lived under a kind of post-Renaissance international order that assumes rights, that assumes kind of basic humanitarian principles. And by the time he gets to the middle chapter where he's discussing the technocratic managerial government that's going to come in for the whole world, he says that that's all going away. Okay, that's gone. And the 20th century marks the end of that, because what it was really about was the removal of the Atlanticist power bloc's two main rivals, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, and then Russia, right? So those were the two potential rivals to the Western power bloc. And now that they have been removed, it's the victory of what you could call liberal democracy, I suppose. Although it's not really that, because if you've read, other writings that sort of complement this, the phrase liberal democracy is more of a selling point. It's more of a propaganda line, because it's not liberal. It's very strictly rigid, ordered, and tiered technocracy, aka what's in Brave New World with the alphas, the omegas, right? And it's not democracy. It's very much ultimately run by AI. Quigley even said in the middle chapter that AI will actually run and govern and determine based on rationing and quantities, everything in life. So they had already kind of projected back then the carbon rationing, the carbon limitations, all that kind of stuff would be implemented. Quigley doesn't give any dates, but later writers kind of project in the terms of the actuaries of the 10, 20, 30, 50-year plans. They kind of give dates. But long story short, the middle chapter is the one that's kind of overlooked, because it details the technocracy and the fact that all of society will be run by AI and computers. And then the most famous chapter that people refer to in Tragedy and Hope is the one where he talks about the elite putting all of this money into, of that time, particularly in the UK and in the US, putting so much money into liberal left and socialist causes. And so the book, he says, ironically, the Birchers, and I'm not a John Birch type of person, but he says that back at that time, the John Birch people had stumbled on basically what was going on, but they didn't know how to fit it into the narrative, because they thought that it was Moscow that was funding all the left and the socialist causes. And it wasn't. He says, no, it was the Rockefellers. It was the elite families in the West that were putting so much money into these magazines and into the institutes, into the universities. In fact, this even was known in terms of the Reese Committee. So we actually had hearings in the U.S. known as the Reese Committee hearings, where they investigated the funding of liberal socialist causes via the most wealthy families and foundations in the U.S. It's like obvious. I mean, it's not even disputed, right? But one thing that happens in the U.S. and probably happens in the U.K. too, I think, with some of the inquiries that you guys have, is that people do these inquiries and these investigations. They discover a whole bunch of skullduggery and scammery and evil, and then it just gets forgotten.
Yeah. Yes. So why? You're absolutely right. I mean, almost everything that's wrong in the world, if you can follow the paper trail, then it goes back to the Rockefeller Foundation, say, or these various foundations, which I know are partly tax dodging devices, aren't they? But the amount of money that gets poured into liberal causes, I mean, George Soros, I suppose, is the most obvious name in this. What's the end goal? Why? How does it work? Why do they do this? What's the benefit to their master plan of having all these activities taking place?
Well, one thing I would add is that it's not all, I mean, I know you know this, but just for the sake of the audience, the power elite don't always just fund liberal causes. A lot of times that seems to be the most advantageous, because they want to change society. So they have, for example, change agents. And so this is a long-term, decades-long plan of, for example, propping up and funding people in the 60s counterculture revolution, right? So a lot of the people who came out as these sort of troubadours of tune in, turn on, drop out,
Yeah.
you know, Leary was a change agent. And that's why he got this sort of Harvard and elite funding for what he was doing and dosing everybody with LSD, was because the work, it was like an evangelist, right? So the change agents kind of function as these evangelists. I think people have even talked about Obama being a kind of a change agent, right? Which was whatever time point these people exist in, it's their job is to push the narrative, to push the Overton window to the next phase of the revolution. And Leary was very successful at that. There were many other people around his time. Owsley Stanley, who was the guy going around with Grateful Dead, who was handing out 4 million tabs of LSD with the Dead. That was all done with the establishment propping up and funding. That was all intentional. They were change agents. In fact, I think Fritjof Capra, another one of the big global elites, you may have heard of him, given the work that you do, deconstructing the green agenda and the green narrative. Capra is one of these big global pushers who wrote a book called Turning Point. And in Turning Point, he said, back, I think it was 1981 or two, he says the change agents are going to be crucial for transforming not just man's view of the world, but man's view of man. So understanding that man is a cancer on the planet, not being made in the image of God, who has rights and this kind of stuff, right? But rather seeing man or fellow human beings as even essential and non-essential. I dug up via one of my buddies who sent me this old policy paper book from the 80s, early 80s, a book, it's called Millennium, and it has a selection of authors. It's got Leary's in there, Marilyn Ferguson's in there, who wrote Aquarian Conspiracy. It's got a couple other of these big luminaries. Wallace Harmon, who wrote Changing Images of Man. Harmon wrote an essay in this book about how when the technocracy begins to come into play, he doesn't give a date, but he's thinking that down in the future. He says there will be a classification of essential and non-essential workers. So they had already had this sort of division planned out back in the 70s and 80s. And I know that that's maybe even older in fiction with like Brave New World, but yeah. So I went off on a tangent there, but yeah, that's what we're looking at here, is a situation where they I forgot, where were we at?
Well,
you
were talking about change agents, and I was really asking the question.
Oh yeah, change agents.
Why do things like the Rockefeller Foundation and George Soros, why do they
That's
fund
right. Liberal causes? That's right. I think because liberalism itself is fundamentally the most useful for destruction in a way.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I view it like a wrecking ball, right? So if you promote a bunch of liberalism, the wrecking ball kind of comes through and it clears out everything that was before. And that kind of allows you to rebuild it and re-image it in the way that you see fit. Harmon, I mentioned, he has one of the most famous white papers or policy papers called Changing Images of Man. And that whole document is about worldviews. It's about philosophy, worldviews, and how to alter everybody's view of nature and each other. And by doing so, this would be the means by which you could get people into that technocratic government, that technocratic order. And he says that it will require the change agents, and liberalism is the most useful for this. The only time that there seems to be the funding of the right is when there's the need to have some sort of, right-wing quote extremist, right, who like a McVeigh, right? So now in those kinds of situations, then you can, in my view, then you can fund the right wing or something like that. Soros, for example, in the Ukraine, put with the State Department, put money into probably right sector, which is the neo-Nazi movements in Ukraine. So there are times in which the same power structure will put money into the far right, but that's just because they're tools and patsies.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Green Movement, because I suppose this was my first inkling that things were not quite right. So I wrote this book 10 years ago now called Watermelons, about maybe longer ago actually, about ClimateGate and all that. And I sort of set out to examine if global warming isn't a problem, if climate change is, the climate changes all the time and we're not really making much difference and there's nothing to worry about, then how has this thing become the dominant, one of the dominant genres in kind of in political discourse? Why is everyone talking about it? And I got sort of 3/4 of the way there, but I hadn't realized the bottom line, which is that the whole of the environmental agenda is the purest bollocks. It is just absolutely made up. It is junk science. It is lies. And every time you it's like whack-a-mole. Every time you respond to another piece of false information, they just come up with another one. And there are so many of them, and there are so few of us that and I hadn't realized that the climate agenda, the green agenda, is a key part of the technocracy narrative, that they want to make us, as you say, hate humanity. The earth has a cancer, the cancer is man. The voluntary human extinction movement. There will always be a few crazies, useful idiots who push the narrative further, and they then pour money into these causes. And I mean, the green movement is so well funded. I get emails every day from different green outfits, which are obviously very well funded, very well resourced, just pushing more bollocks.
I think the green movement, as I'm sure you know, has roots in Malthusianism, right? I mean, the Malthusian idea that these fake crises. I remember when I was doing grad work, I had a few days off, just sort of working in the library, and I gave myself a task. I was going to look up everything I could find with Paul Ehrlich, right, who's one of these early crusaders for this stuff. So I went and I found in the research databases all these old things that he had written in the late 70s and early 80s, these papers, and he was talking about the coming ice age, how we know that by the 80s and 90s there's going to be woolly mammoths rocking around, and we're going to be like, huddled up like Jeremiah Johnston or whatever in some cave, and it's all this nonsense, right? It was all pure baloney. Yeah. And then you could see, because I was a child of the 80s, I remember in the 80s when the narrative shifted to the ozone layer. That was all they talked about, the ozone layer. It's got a hole and we're all going to get cooked. We're going to get microwaved and we're going to, pop like a egg in the microwave or something like that. And it's all nonsense, right? And then the narrative shifted to global warming, right, in the 90s, 2000s, and then it shifts into, so you could tell that they were just like PR rebranding it, just giving it a new rebranding each, and so that started sticking out to me. And I remember what you on Alex back in when your book came out. I remember hearing those interviews where you were talking about this. I listened to a lot of the interviews with and documentary work that Lord Monckton had done. And it was obvious to me that was right around the time I was reading a lot of these global elite books, and I noticed that this is exactly what their plan does, is it creates the idea that man is the problem. If you read that document, First Global Revolution, that the Club of Rome put out, it says, we have decided that the problem will be man is the pollutant. Carbon is the problem, right? And what is carbon? Carbon is life, right? So that once you understand the anti-human, anti-natalist movement now, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion, that has all the same top funding, all the same people funding the vegan movement, by the way, which is also a big part of this agenda now. I found some of the global elite writers back in the 70s were saying, Stanford research documents were saying that we'll promote veganism. We'll tie it to anarchism. We'll tie it to punk movements, because that was at the time when punk was new. They were saying, oh, look, let's co-opt this punk movement, get them into anarchism and veganism. And he said that'll be a big factor for control in the future, because like Plato even said this back in the Republic. Plato said, don't feed the proles meat, give them grains, right? We get them carb bloated, and because meat, the belief was, and I think it's true, it makes you virile. It gives you a lot of the nutrients that you actually need. So I think that diet is huge. When you go and you read these guys that like Bertrand Russell and a lot of the Malthusians, the eugenicists, when you read Galton Darwin, when you read H.G. Wells, you know, they all just wrote all of this into their books. And so I just kind of went down this project, like you said, a rabbit hole dive of reading all of these people. I've gone through about 50 of the books